and I'm starting that now. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all today to the World Philosophies lecture series. And my colleague Elvis, who is normally our compere and host, is at a conference today, so I'm standing in for him. He'll be back next week. But one thing I'd like to draw your attention to as we get started, before I introduce our amazing speaker today, I'd just like to quickly draw your attention to, we have a new YouTube channel for the Center for Global and Comparative Philosophies. And this talk will be recorded and uploaded onto that. And I've just put that link in the chat, but you also can see other talks that have been a part of this series as well. And if you don't know, just to give you a bit of information about us, if this is your first time or you don't know, we're based out of the World, SOAS University of London and the World Philosophies program there, and the Center for Global and Comparative Philosophies. We attempt to be quite unique and pioneering in our philosophical research, and our primary objective is to shift the focus of philosophical debates away from an emphasis solely on Western philosophy toward a more robust and comprehensive engagement with philosophical traditions of the world. So again, please do check out that YouTube link where the videos from this series have been uploaded and more information about the center, which is the host of this lecture series. And again, just a reminder, when I'll continue to admit people, but please do mute yourselves so that there's minimal background noise. Well, today I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Professor Elizabeth Kassab, who's joined us. Just a few words of introduction, if you don't already know. Professor Kassab studied philosophy at the American University of Beirut and Freiburg in Switzerland. And she taught in Lebanon at the American University of Beirut and has been a visiting professor at a number of universities in Europe, the US, including Bonn, Columbia, Yale, and Brown. And you can read more information on the invite about her, but just a few key things to note is that her research interests center on Western and post-colonial philosophies of culture and contemporary Arab thought and philosophy. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that she received the Sheikh Zayed Book Award in Abu Dhabi in the category of the Contribution to the Development of Nations for the Arabic version of her book, Contemporary Arab Thought. And some of my students will recognize that title along with her Enlightenment on the Eve of Revolution. So it is my absolute honor and pleasure to welcome you here today, Elizabeth, and I'll turn it over to you to share your screen. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me in this unusual lecture series. I mean, world philosophies and philosophies outside the Western world don't have a forum every day. So I'm happy to be part of this. And I will try to entertain you in the coming 45 minutes about contemporary, modern and contemporary Arab philosophy. So I will share my screen. And here we are. Do you see it?
Yep.
Good. So it's not, I won't be talking about classical and medieval Islamic philosophy, which is the more well-known one, but we will be discussing a little bit the modern and contemporary, and I will be speaking more about the contemporary rather than the modern tradition. Now, since we are in a very eventful part of the world, I will start with the world. I mean, it's a world philosophy lecture series, so let's start with the world in our part of the world. And historically, I will define the period I will be talking about between the last century, let's say, the last 100 years between 1922 and 2022. So the first half, the first 50 years will be the ones I will associate with modern philosophy, and the second half, the second 50 years with the contemporary one. Now, as you all know, the first 50 years witnessed the fall of the Ottoman Empire, then the British and French mandates, and then the wave of independence, roughly in those first 50 years between 1922 and 1971. So let me quickly show you some maps connected with those events. Let us start with the Arab world on the eve of World War I. Now, if you follow the green line, you see what the Ottoman Empire included on the eve of World War I. You know that the Ottoman Empire had been there for about 4 centuries and expanding and then regressing a little bit. But around the time that interests us, this is a little bit the area that was under Ottoman. And when I say under Ottoman Empire, I mean that these regions were officially administrative units or entities inside the Ottoman Empire. Then, because the British and the French are such charitable and humanity-loving powers, they came to our rescue to get us ready for independence after the Ottoman Empire vanished after the First World War. So if you look at this colorful map, you will recognize the dark green Algeria, which was occupied by the French, which was French territory. The protectorates, so occupations with a lesser degree in Morocco, Tunisia, mandates in Syria, Lebanon. Then we have the British in Iraq, in a different form in Sudan, in southern Yemen. The purple under Italian rule, and the yellow areas which had already gotten their independence, and the pink ones were these truce protectorates or under British rule. Okay. Then comes the wave of independence. So it covers roughly those first 50 years we're talking about, starting, say, with Egypt, but these are gradual steps towards independence, if you want, agreements, then Saudi Arabia, 32, Iraq, 30, of course, the big liberation of Algeria in 1962. So this is how, and then the last ones to witness independence are the Gulf states. All right. So now we have this Arab world. I'm sorry, it's a blurred picture. I couldn't get it right. But this yellow map is what we consider to be the Arab world. Okay. So in this first 50 years, so as I said, countries or regions are moving from Ottoman administration to British and French mandates to independence. Universities are being set up and young men are being sent to Europe, many of them to Paris, to study philosophy, then come back and establish departments where they taught and translated a lot of European philosophy, attempted at writing histories of philosophy. These were men who read texts in the original languages, who studied with important professors in the original languages. And so when they came back, their main focus was academic. In other words, to introduce students to main currents of European philosophy, and some of them of Islamic philosophy. So I think that what characterizes the practice of philosophy, of teaching and writing in philosophy in the first 50 years was rather academic. And now you will understand why, in what way it will be less academic in the coming 50 years. Now, In the second half, about which I will speak more at length now. In other words, the era after independence. I'm sorry, I will have to mention a number of events because I think we cannot speak about the Arab world, about intellectual output in the Arab world, about philosophy writing in the Arab world without being familiar a little bit with this context. So I will go very quickly over these few dates and mention some of the marking events. 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel and the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes and lands. And as you know, the conflict still goes on 75 years later. 1952, the overthrow of the Egyptian monarchy and the coming to power of Abdel Nasser. 1956, Abdel Nasser nationalizing the Suez Canal and being attacked for it by Israel, France, and Britain. And also with that gaining huge popularity in this wave of independence and decolonization, not only in Egypt, but across the Arab world. 1958 is the overthrow of the Iraqi monarchy. Between 1958 and 61, there is the attempt of unity between Egypt and Syria, which will impact both countries. 1963, it's the coming of the Ba'ath Party to power, both in Syria and Iraq. So you see the 50s are quite eventful. 1967 is quite a landmark in this period. As you know, it's the defeat of the Arabs against Israel. And I think there is a consensus that this turn marked the Arab world on many, many, many levels, military, economic, political, but also cultural and intellectual. 1969, the coming of Gaddafi to power with a military coup in Libya. 1970, the coming of Hafez al-Assad, the Assad father, to power in Syria. 1975 to 1990, the Lebanese Civil War, through which I grew up. 1978, it is the Camp David Accord and the withdrawal of Egypt from the United Arab Front against Israel. Quite a seismic change in the Arab geopolitical landscape. 1979, the Iranian Revolution. And who knows what is awaiting us now as things move in Iran. So, and 79 is also the coming of Saddam Hussein to power. So you have in this 10 years, three of the major dictators, Assad, Saddam Hussein, and Gaddafi being established, civil wars going on, the Yemen civil war in the background since the 50s. Then comes 1980, the Iran-Iraq war that devastated both countries. It will go on till 1988. 1981, the assassination of Anwar Sadat because of his agreement. 1982, two important events, the invasion of the entirety of Lebanon, including Beirut, by Israel, and the repression of the Hama uprising in Syria. 1989, the fall of the Soviet Union. 1990, I'm sorry, but it goes on. 1990, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. 2000, the death of Hafez al-Assad, father, and the coming of his son, Bashar, and the very short Damascus Spring. 2003, the US-led invasion and devastation of Iraq. 2005, the assassination of our prime minister in Lebanon. 2006, another invasion of Israel on Lebanon. And we reached 2010, which I think most of us agree that it will be another landmark, another turn in the history of this area. And you know what has followed, what has been happening since then in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Egypt, and in Tunisia, in Lebanon, in Palestine, etc. So this is the world of our philosophy. Whoops. I don't know why my screen seems to be frozen. Okay. So if we want to summarize a little bit, these selected events, mind you, in between two dates, there are other events that, of course, I won't mention. So we have military dictatorships that come with the rule of brutality, loss of liberties, repression, the manipulation of internal division by these dictators, civil wars, interstate wars, failed attempts at unity, the Cold War, of course, operating, economic failure, corruption, surge of religious fundamentalism, and a massive foreign interference as a constant. Now, so forget about that serene academic practice of philosophy inside peaceful departments and peaceful universities and countries. So the weight of events is, in my opinion, present in the intellectual output in general, including in philosophy. And the dominating concern, if you want, there is a need to make sense of all these events that not only are, you know, some incident on some border somewhere. These are, each one of the events that I mentioned have impacted hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, economically, politically, militarily, with massive expulsions and deaths and assassinations. And there is clearly an environment of restricted liberties. There is a deterioration of the state services, including education. One technique of repression and control was to replace philosophy departments with religious classes, especially in North Africa. The shutting down of social science institutes, I think of Morocco and I think of Tunisia. These legacies of colonialism, the French had left institutes of social science, which were very interesting places for, after independence, for scholars, local scholars, to start getting to know their societies, finding out about social issues which did not please the powers in place, and these institutes were shut down. Now, as we read the intellectual output and the philosophical output of these decades, we see that regularly there are conferences or writings meant to assess how things are going, how is the teaching of philosophy going, and how is the writing going. The dominating preoccupation or the mood is, of course, disenchantment with independence, because the events I enumerated are not really were not the promises of independence. The failure of the post-independence state and the consequences for societies, economically, culturally, intellectually. And I think that one of the interesting ways of following up the debates is to look at two lines of explanation. In other words, when you look at all what happened and try to explain it, you see that there are two trends. Some people say, the reason why all these things happen, it's because of our culture. There's something wrong with our culture that leads us or that prevents us from developing good functioning states, democracy. We don't think properly. We're not modern enough, or we're too modernized and we have lost our connection with our roots. We're not secularized enough, or we're too religious enough, or we're not religious enough. And the discussion goes on. So that's one trend, trying to make sense of this disenchanting post-independence by looking at culture and quickly becoming culturalist in the sense of wanting to explain everything through culture. The other line of explanation is a political one. In other words, to say, look, things are going wrong and have been going wrong, not because we have the wrong religion or the wrong tradition or the wrong modernity. It's because we don't have democracy, because there is no political life. We are not able to hold rulers accountable. And you see these competing lines. Of course, the culturalist is more vocal, is more loud, let me say, because it's easier, or it's less repressed, because governments are happy to let people talk indefinitely about cultural authenticity and what have you, rather than have them examine their political and economic policies. But you see that if you're attentive enough, the political explanation is there all the time. And then something that preoccupies people, like it does in other post-independence countries and regions, is this business of identity and authenticity, culture and modernity. Now, if we look, now finally I come to the more philosophical writings. If I want to identify a few themes that were quite prominent in this period, I would say it's the concern with philosophical autonomy and authenticity. In other words, this yearning or this quest for developing a philosophy of one's own. What does it mean? How do you develop an Arab philosophy that is not a copy of the French, not a copy of the American, etc.? And then this business of modernity and tradition, how are they to be connected to in this endeavor of producing a philosophy of one's own? The other big cluster of topics is, especially after the surge of religious fundamentalism, this business of religion, the need to address religion with the issues that it raises, reform, the need for reform, the failure of reform, the reasons for the failure of reform, the conditions of reform, the need to understand the phenomenon of fundamentalism, religious hermeneutics, philosophical hermeneutics, secularism. These are big topics of discussion in this second 50 years. And finally, I would mention, of course, I'm being selective here, reason. Is really, for instance, to put a stupid title here, is Islam inimical to reason or not? Is there an Islamic reason? Is there an Arab reason? Is there reason? Do we have reason? Do we have too much reason, not enough reason? What is rationality? Where do we find it? Is reason Western? So is being rational, or is practicing rationality becoming Westernized, etc.? Now, what I want to do is to put a little bit these philosophical concerns in a broader comparative frame. which I did a little bit in my book on contemporary Arab thought. And I like to go back always to this 1947 Inter-American Philosophy Conference that took place in New York. Now, this Inter-American Philosophy Conference was the second one, and it's North Americans and South Americans getting together in the aftermath of the collapse of Europe. Now, World War II has destroyed Europe, especially Paris. It has lost its civilizational and philosophical leadership. And the question at this conference was, who is the suitable heir of this leadership? So North Americans and South Americans were discussing whether or who was who was qualified to take over this philosophical leadership. The South Americans were saying, you know, we're too poor. Can we become leaders? And the North Americans were saying, we're too rich. Can we become leaders in things like culture and philosophy? We have, you know, big industries and a lot of money and we buy stuff, but are we really able to lead? It's quite an interesting conference. And of course, that's where you hear for the first time, what is South American philosophy or Latin American philosophy? Is there such a thing? And what would that imply? How would you recognize what would make a philosophy South American or North American? Now, so these Americans were not different. They are post-colonial in that sense, if you want, like we are, that after the hegemony or the leadership of European philosophy and civilization, who do we have those, that what makes a civilization or a region culturally or philosophically well respected? I followed some of these debates in Latin America and Africa and noticed the following. I will quickly give the characteristics and then compare them to the Arab one. So in Latin America, the big concern is that of mimicry, in the sense that, you know, in Latin America, you have European languages, European philosophy, European religion, everything that was native was more or less wiped out. So what would make a Venezuelan piece of writing in philosophy or a Mexican piece of writing something other than just imitating what is being produced in Paris or in Spain? So these people were battling with imitation. Their big concern, seemed to me, was imitation. The Africans were busy proving that they can do philosophy at all, because they were told by European racists that, you know, Africans are good perhaps at singing or dancing or, I don't know, being one with nature or what have you, but really not logical thinking. So can the African think philosophically, logically? You know, the debates about ethnophilosophy, etc. So it's the very possibility of philosophy that is a big concern for the Africans. And what would be this African philosophy? What is African authenticity? Big questions. And in all of these cases where, you know, you get into this question of, is there a Latin American, North American, African philosophy? The question is about the characteristics. So at first sight, it sounds so obvious, so sort of, yeah, of course, taken for granted that, you know, something is African, is not French. But then when you start looking at it, it gets, as you know, a bit more complicated. Now, for the Arabs, there was no question about the need to prove themselves because of this fantastic classical heritage written contrary to the African case. So it's there in your face, written, recognized even by the Europeans, that Arabs can do philosophy, and that they were super good at it. But then the challenge was, well, why then did we sort of deteriorate in our performance and let others take the leadership, or do we measure up to our own past? So in the case of the Arabs, there is no need to prove that you can do philosophy. The challenge is to say, nowadays, you're no longer in the classical age, and you're not European, and you're not doing very well. So the need to make sense of that, and then how do you produce a philosophy that is neither a copy of the old nor a copy of the contemporary European, of the modern European? Now, and I'm slowly coming to the end of my presentation. In this zeal to prove that you have a philosophy of your own, my sense is that you are tempted to fall in three problematic things. First one being logocentrism. In what sense? That you know that also from European, a certain type of European Orientalism, Muslims, Islam, whatever that is, I mean, whatever you put under that, was considered to be, not very rational. That rationality is not the thing of Muslims. Europe, Westerners are logical, rational people. Whereas these Arabs, they need to prove that. Also because if modernity and philosophy are closely associated with rationality, then you as a Muslim or as an Arab, depending on how you situate yourself and define yourself, you will have to find a way of saying, we have rationality too. And our rationality and our being rational is not being imitations of you. We can be rational on our own, because the proof being that if we turn to our tradition, we find in it an autochthonous, local rationality. Hence all the movements back to Averroes. Now, in this zeal, people have tended to value everything rational, everything logical, to the detriment of everything that is not rational, everything that is not written. So the oral, the emotional, the bodily, all of that was sort of sacrificed, if you want, in this zeal to prove yourself as a civilization or a people capable of reason. And I find this problematic, because all of those non-rational things are precious to humans and to everything we produce and how we live. And we know the problems of logocentrism from other places who have practiced that in certain periods of time. So that's one problem. The other is the exaggerated, or let me say, the accentuation of unity. Because you are, again, in the zeal of confronting dividing forces, and there were and still are constantly. And also because part of the dreams of independence was to reconstitute or constitute some kind of a unity. And in the search for how this region would look like after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, you were looking for, or many were looking for, unity, unifying elements, language, and this Arab nationalist zeal sacrificed the plurality of the region in terms of languages and ethnicities and religions. So there was a waves of, or temptations at, unifying by force, or a kind of an authoritarian homogenization tendency. And so I think that philosophy has also come under this, the weight of this need to find unities everywhere, and with a tradition that is associated with a highly monotheistic religion, then the notion of the one has an impact that can be problematic. And lastly, the will to power. When I read this intellectual and philosophical output and this attempt at forming a present culture, philosophical idea, philosophical corpus, there is this dream often of re-establishing past glory. That because there is this memory more or less blurred, I mean, I think people assume that they know this past. I don't know how much that is really cognitively sound, but that this past was associated with a status of preeminence, that you are in a struggle against the world, against an invading and hegemonic world, which is very real. So the temptation to write with the will to power, I think, is not the best thing we can do to ourselves, or that a thought can do to itself. And I put this here, the will to power versus empowerment. How do you empower yourself? Is the will to power an empowering thing? I think this is a question that contemporary Arabs need to ask themselves. These are three questions that I try to think about as I work on contemporary Arab philosophy. And I will close my talk with these remarks, one on field and one on contemporary. First of all, the field. What is contemporary Arab philosophy? What do you put under it? If I develop a syllabus on contemporary philosophy, what am I supposed to include? Is it taught? No, it is rarely taught. It is not yet canonized with all the evil and the goods that come with that. So it's a field of study, if you wish, that is in the making. And we have to keep this in mind. So it's not that I'm talking about a field that is easily recognizable. And lastly, are we contemporaneous with this contemporary Arab philosophy? And I'm thinking, of course, of 2010 as a turning point. I worked in the last few decades on what I called contemporary philosophy or contemporary Arab thought, basically between 1967 and roughly 2010. That's when my book came out. So I thought that's contemporary philosophy, contemporary Arab thought. And now, with all that has been happening in the Arab world, I think I and a few others have been wondering, to what extent is that those few decades and what was produced during those decades contemporary to us today? And I think this is a question in the making. I teach this stuff to my students, and I'm always curious. I ask them, do you relate to this? Do you relate to the quest of a philosophy of my own? And they look at my face like, no, what is this? Why should I worry about that? Or, the big concern with tradition. My God, the amount of energy that was produced to write about tradition in books and articles and conferences. And I don't think the young men and women today are spending, their nights staying up worrying about tradition. So for me, it's a lot of fun to confront this material with people today, and hence take this as the contemporary in quotation marks, and the field in quotation marks, and all of my remarks in quotation marks. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Kassab, for a very, very, a very, very fascinating overview. And I was lots of thought-provoking questions that came up for me. We have plenty of time for questions, and so I have a few now, but just use the raise hand function, and I might just ask if there's any from the floor prior to me jumping in with all the thoughts that I have. So I'll give people a second. Actually, I will ask a question while I give people a second to collect their thoughts. So just use the raise hand function and I'll look at the queue. At the end, you were talking about the three traps of three zeals, I'll call it that. And I was really struck by that, because I was kind of wondering if in your work and your experiences you're talking about with your students, is there an exit strategy to that, or is it something we are caught within and are always negotiating within ourselves? And in particularly in the contemporary Arab situation. So that's one question that came to mind just as a launching point, and then I'll move on.
Good question. Thank you, Andrew. I think becoming aware of it is something to start with. I mean, it's good that we become aware that our writing or our thinking has these, I call them the demons of Arab philosophy, but I didn't want to put that in a title. I call it here, when I speak among ourselves here in the region, I allow myself to say that, but not, it's a different story to call it. We've been demonized enough, so I'm very careful with that. Demons in the sense that, dangerous temptations. And I think you're right, maybe there is no exit, and it's not, our concern should not be to solve this once and for all, but at least to become aware of it.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I believe it was Dr. Hawthorne next.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry I can't have my camera on. I'm not in a venue that enables me to have my camera on. I loved this talk very, very much, and I think it speaks to so many of the things that we in the center are thinking through very much. The problem of the past versus the present. What does contemporary thought mean if we're constantly having to look back to a kind of colonial, post-colonial moment, the extra burden that is given to the post-colonial to account for the past, so that contemporary thought in the non-European world has to continually kind of concern itself with that immediate past. And I was really, really struck by what you were saying about the issue of religion itself. And in the work that I do, the issue of religion itself and the idea that perhaps Islam or other things themselves are religions is in itself quite a kind of Eurocentric framing. To think of Islam in that way is to think of it in terms of the European concept of religion as something that has its kind of own private domain that is separate from the political, from tradition, from jurisprudence, from economics, from sociality, but also is kind of embedded in the past. And I would be really interested to hear from you about where religion kind of fits within all of this, because I would argue that philosophers in this context need to contend and confront this particular understanding of religion against which excuse me, European philosophy has always kind of structured itself almost against. And so when we're thinking about the possibility of contemporary Arab thought in the context of modernity, or whatever we want to call it, we need to engage with that history that says, oh, philosophy is separate from this thing that we name as religion in that European sense, and sort of think of Arab thought as the kind of postal workers who carry the Greek corpus across to Europe, but then, you know, kind of fade from view, fade from history. To me, that is part of that history of coloniality that says there can be no contemporary thought other than European thought.
Thank you. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that this opposition between philosophy on the one hand and religion on the other is rather a European thing. I'm not sure about that as far as the Arab debates are concerned, because there seems to be quite a strong need among Arab thinkers to draw also such lines. That religion is one set of beliefs and assumptions and forms of reasoning, and philosophy is another one. There is a whole set of writings in that sense. I'm talking about the 50s, the 60s, 70s, and so on. But confusion there is for Arabs, not so much because they're measuring things according to European conceptions, but because de facto in the history of this region and in its cultural output, things have been interconnected. When you say Islamic tradition, what do you mean? And that's the million-dollar question for Arab thinkers themselves, because things have been interrelated. When you say Islamic civilization, what do you mean exactly? Or Islamic, let's stick with Islamic tradition. Do you mean the religious tradition, which is a very rich tradition spanning centuries and huge encyclopedic works of hermeneutics, of legal thinking, of which has also been interdisciplinary. So are you thinking of that? Are you thinking of literary tradition, traditions of poetry, traditions of storytelling? Are you talking about scientific writings, tradition, astronomy, science, medicine, mathematics? Are you thinking about medieval traditions of philosophy? So this confusion or this interconnection, this lack of clarity also blurs, I think, or weighs on contemporary Arab debates, that it's so ubiquitous, this business of tradition, but you're never sure what the person talking has in mind. Is it the philosophical tradition, the scientific, the literary, the religious? And sometimes assumptions are made without clarification. So I think there is confusion and there is need. I think it would help Arab debates to get some clarity about it. So it's not, I don't think that it's only because people are trying to measure up to European criteria, because I think in this part of the world, intellectual output has been quite interdisciplinary, and hence the difficulty. And you don't know what people, when they're appealing to tradition, what they're exactly appealing to. Sometimes I think it's appealing to the power and the glory of an empire.
May I come back on that, Chair?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm just so sorry I can't have my camera on, because you would have seen me kind of nodding away. But I think my point here is rather that when we use terms like interdisciplinary, when we use terms like religion, philosophy, tradition, and so on, we're already caught up in a discourse that has functionally differentiated these things. And I think of the Arab word deen, which has a very different sense to how, for example, a deen is always translated in English as religion. In the body of scholarship that I'm familiar with. But I always think that's a kind of impoverishment of the concept, because it subordinates itself to Eurocentric ideas that religion has this kind of separate element, whereas deen has this like richer sense of a kind of total social system within which you have the literary, you have the scientific, you have the economic, you have the kinship system, you have the kind of social comportment understanding, and so on. But I also think that this division between the contemporary and the traditional comes out of part of that history, where modernity is this kind of colonial demand placed upon other cultures to say, you be like me, you fit your complex, differentiated contexts and understandings and social structures into this really quite rigid, structured, functionally differentiated social context, where we will be able to differentiate between what is philosophy and what is not. And I wonder if in the Arab context that you're speaking of, whether that becomes almost a kind of, I don't quite know what the word is, but a kind of a way in which the important conversation becomes deflected, because it's still dealing with the terms that the colonial milieu demands. Whereas if we're going to talk about a contemporary philosophy that isn't really kind of caught up with that context, we might then want to think about the kinds of things that people like Frantz Fanon are talking about as the potential for the novel, the new, the imaginary, that's really not caught up in that particular history, and always already having to respond to it and sort of talk about what Arab philosophy is in the terms that are not their own, which is not to say that what you've presented, I think is wonderful, because there's obviously a very rich conversation going on there. I'm not trying to say, oh, it's just simply a kind of response to the European attempt to own philosophy, but rather there surely must be a contemporary Arab philosophy that's not engaging with that history. And to me, this is therefore a question about how are we understanding contemporary rather than a kind of binary between tradition, the past versus the present, contemporary, and so on. And sorry to kind of go on and dominate the conversation. I'm quite happy to kind of step back at this point, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Thank you,
Sean. I think that it's as far as the logocentrism is concerned, I would agree with you that there is this this urge to show that you're perfectly as logocentric as the Europeans are. But other than that, to say that religion, deen, would encompass many things and not differentiate between science and philosophy and literature and poetry, I would be a bit more cautious. I'm not exactly sure that I would agree with that.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm going to go on to Mohammed Shas now.
Hi, Mohammed.
Hello, Elizabeth. Ahleen. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. It's great always to. You hear me, right? Yeah, it's great always to listen to you. You know, I'm new to this platform, so thank you, Andrew Hines, for having organized this. I have a couple of points, so if you allow me some time. I am with you in what you said, and we kind of you know that, right? I think, as you said, I will start from your last point in the presentation. I think there is still a lot to be done. First, on the unexplored names of Arab scholars to be further explored, to be written more on, and after that, to write a history of that exploration. So I think what you are doing is amazing work. I've read a lot, and as I told you once, I use your book for my teaching, Introduction to Arab Contemporary Arab Thought. And apart from some, it appears to me that apart from some chapters in anthologies in contemporary Arab thought, which you don't find in philosophy, Western philosophy, that's no one. For the last 10, 15 years, maybe we don't have, from your last book, I haven't seen any new production on Arab thought, apart from maybe one. And it's kind of sporadic, not systematic, not. I think there is something there, and maybe we are so much as in academia in the West, Western institutions. I'm speaking from Rome. There's still a lot of politics there, and Middle Eastern politics and political Islam. I think there's only when that stage is overcome, and maybe after the Arab Spring, as you said, 2010 is another important date. I think it will kind of put this political Islam in academia at the center. It will kind of recede a little bit and leave space back, hopefully, to kind of normal academia, or to look at what is unexplored yet. That's one. I do think there are, then that's my general point. Second point is that there are broadly two major trends. Besides the tradition that you have centralized, there is the other trend that is kind of works on Western philosophy. Within working on the tradition, there are two trends. One that wants to reappropriate it to move on, and the one that says, look, there is nothing to learn from it because its episteme is different. Modernity is something else. So there is nothing we can learn from the tradition. We move on. And then this is a tradition. As to the other trend of Arab philosophy, is that it's the one that engages with European philosophy, modern philosophy. And these ones are not known in Western academia. They are hardly, well, because the Europeans anyway, or Euro-Americans, they don't care to see what the Arabs think of Habermas or what the Arabs think of John Rawls. It's like, what would they add? That's like the point, you know? And that's another field that is not explored. And that's the task of Europeans, not of the Arabs. So to reverse a little bit the gaze. And that requires, at the end, overcoming also the Orientalistic view of language. It's a lot taught as a communicative language, and a lot is being explored, and its dialects are studied by anthropologists and sociologists in the Arab world. And there is the move beyond the European classical Orientalism and focalizing its dialects because they need them for anthropology, sociology. But they do lack actually standard classical Arabic. And that's why they don't maybe, there is a generation of scholars of Arab Muslim societies, not only the Arab world, that they don't have the requisites for reading classical Arab intellectual history. And that's another problem that Arab Islam societies will face. Maybe they are not aware of it now, but later on we'll realize that there is a gap between the intellectual and because the focus has been only on the current dynamics and political Islam or of the kind. I'm sorry if I'm taking a few more notes. So that's the second point. The third point is that it was mentioned by the first commenter. I think we will be stuck there for a while in intellectual history about where philosophy and theology, where they meet and where they not, and why do the Arab scholars who work on the tradition do still stick to the tradition. I think the dilemma or the challenge there, it's not an easy challenge, as you know well, is the ethical, weight there. I mean, the ethical in the sense of the philosophical, theological, and how the ethical navigates between the two. And if we want to do philosophical discussions, it's metaphysics, right? If we want to keep it, we don't need to, the Arabs or Latin Americans or the Indians, they and also in transient contemporary Western philosophy, for the last few decades, going back how to cope with religion in the public sphere from later Habermas or Rawls, the political liberalism of Rawls is a way of finding space for the political, or Charles Taylor has spoken of the eminent frame. It's like a third way, whenever I see that, or I think of wasatiyya, not in religious terms, not in, I want to philosophize it, so I think there is a lot that, and all that is philosophic, it looks like only religious, but I think that would be really for me, and I think you do, and you are on the same line, that that's where the challenge. It's like it's really a predicament, but at the same time, it's intellectually challenging. While some want to overcome it by only leaving religious ethos out, the challenge intellectually, if there is any contribution, maybe it would be how to navigate that space. I don't want to say also the common term to secularize theology, but it's something like that. I don't know, I don't have another word, but there is, that's why some scholars in the Arab world say, let's focus aesthetics. And you have also done a different thing. You focalize funun tashkiliya, the arts. There is now a number. I'm sorry, I'm taking some time, but it's always lovely to engage with Elizabeth. There is, from a Moroccan example that I focalize, scholars of philosophy, some of them do write historical novels. So they take, they take sometimes Averroes or Ibn Rushd, and they write historical novels about them. And that's another way of, it's not, structural academic philosophy, it's thought, right? But a way of reappropriating the tradition and focalizing the aesthetic in different formats. Then my question is, with some comments, my question is, I didn't hear something of the Mu'tazilite thing there, though you focalize Arab philosophy, which means all Arabs, whoever writes in Arabic, whatever their denomination is, etc., we know the plurality of the traditions. But I think, and there are a lot of great contributions from the past and the present of non-Muslims to the Islamic tradition, tradition. They, the legitimacy there is sometimes some put it there, but in the majority of scholarship that I haven't come through in the Arab world. I mean, like Fahmi Jada'an speaking on Tahrir al-Islam, right? Or any other, or Wa'il Halaq, a different view, or Azmi Bashara focalizes Arab thought and the Arab world, but the others have gone to the Islamic sphere, and they have, in different ways, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, refer to the Mu'tazilite. Does that come to your reading of contemporary Arab thought, for example? The last point is also like another, and I stop, is I think, I don't want to say that, but at the moment, with the way things are financially, socioeconomically, politically, there is fear that the great days of reviving philosophy in the Arab world may go down, because the last century was maybe not the best, but was great. Scholars were translating, writing, and now, you know, the big names are the ones who maybe stopped their project by the 80s. A few ones still alive, long life, but I hope that activity in the field will go on, because we know how things are. You know, you need also finances to do that, and all the projects, the big ones that we have, they are personal. They are often, not often, maybe always, it's personal investment. The university does not invest. So whatever
could you clarify your question? Sorry to interrupt. Could you clarify your question?
So my point is that there is the financial problem there, socioeconomic, that might hinder the activity that philosophy has experienced in the Arab world for the last century. Thank you. I'm sorry for being long. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Muhammad. I agree with you. I agree, first of all, that this is an understudied field, and this is what I say often. So talk about contemporary philosophy, especially when compared with classical philosophy, Arabs themselves or Muslims themselves would say, what contemporary philosophy or what modern philosophy? When I was working on my book, people would, you know, sarcastically tell me, what, you write a book on Arab philosophy, Arab thought? Do Arabs think? I mean, I'm talking about Arabs here, making the comment. Yes, but in general, I think there is little scholarly effort put in this field. That is true. And it is a field in the making. And we only a few of us have been involved in it. And Muhammad Has is a Moroccan scholar based for a number of years now in Rome. And he's editing a double volume on one of the major thinkers of contemporary Arab thought, Jabiri. When is it coming out, Muhammad? We can't hear you.
You're muted.
Yeah, on Al-Jabri and Taha is out, but on the collective one is within a year, hopefully.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Muhammad is one of the few people who are working in the field, and so it is something in the making. It is true that we don't have the ideal conditions to do it. The political, socio-economic that you mentioned plays a major role. Also, in the sense of, is it worth teaching? All these considerations, what do you include in a curriculum? When you have a department of philosophy nowadays, like we have here at the Doha Institute, do you include contemporary Arab philosophy? I have colleagues who think this is a waste of time, that instead of reading Rawls or some classical Islamic thinker, I spend my time and waste the time of the department and the students reading minor figures from the contemporary time. So this is part of the battle, if you want, all these issues. And I think the interesting point about ethics that you mentioned, I think this is one of the emerging topics nowadays. I think increasingly there is the need to develop ideas on burning, pressing ethical issues that confront us as societies and individuals in this part of the world. So it is true that on the one hand, we worry about the future of this field, but at the same time, we see, impulses and important contributions coming our way. Now, Danny Postel, whom I thank for being here, sent something. He mentioned his book on the reception and engagement of Habermas, Rawls, and Arendt by Iranian thinkers. I think that's important to note. Yeah, the whole issue then, the question is, okay, you refer to repeat the standard question. Are you using Habermas, Rawls, and Arendt as your benchmark theories? Are these your new gurus? Shouldn't you be rather following Ibn Khaldun? But then I think this is the challenge for a contemporary Arab to say that, okay, here are my own questions, and I will take the liberty to use whatever inspiring theory, direction, intellectual direction to elaborate on my own questions. And this is not an easy thing.
Thank you very much for that response. Sohan, you've been waiting for a while. I'll go to you now.
Hi, all. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been really fascinating. I've really enjoyed it, and it's made me think a lot. So I'll just say that I guess I was thinking a lot about what was discussed at the beginning of outlining what the world of Arab philosophy is, and the way that you did that through a historical but also geographical lens. And as a Djiboutian national, to see Djibouti put in yellow and highlighted there, it was quite, it felt a little bit like vindication, but also, you know, it's not something that we often talk about. I guess what I'm thinking about now is at what point do the limits that we put on borders and history, at what point do we start to deal with an Arab philosophy that overflows those geographical borders? And so I'm thinking about Arab philosophers who are, you know, firmly anchored in the West, in whether that's their geographical position or even the language that they write in. So from Djibouti, I'm thinking of Abdurrahman Waberi, I'm thinking of Azouz Begag in France, or even, you know, SOAS's very own Heba Hayek, who writes stories on her experience growing up in Palestine and girlhood in Palestine, but yet is firmly anchored now in London and in the United States. And at what point do we start to deal with Arab and Islamic philosophy as well, that starts to overflow a little bit? And how do we deal with that, even for incoming philosophers? I'm thinking, you know, for people of the Black diaspora, it's also it's a complex thing, but we have the label, you know, you've got African American philosophy, you've got the label of Black philosophy that encompasses much more than this. You've got African philosophy that encompasses the continent. Do we have something similar for the Arab diaspora, or do we get absorbed into the philosophy of where we're staying in? So like Azouz Begag, does he get absorbed into French philosophy, or is there a space for him within Arab philosophy? And I'm asking this in part because I'm wondering, is there a space for me within Arab philosophy? But thank you so much. Yeah, could you talk a little bit?
Good question, Sohan. And this brings me back, I mean, perhaps I didn't mention this enough. The name Arab is complicated because it, what is the Arab world? Is it the Arabic speaking world? Do we define it in terms of the language that is spoken, or is it an ethnic definition? Is it a geographic definition? And I think because of those ideologies that at one point were quite hegemonic in the region, the Arab nationalist project, in its zeal, really wanted to homogenize the region, excluding from it or ignoring the existence of Amazirs, of Kurds, of Armenians, of people who were not ethnically Arab, who were part of, I mean, inhabitants of this region, Christians, Jews who are not Muslim and yet Arab. So I think today people are much more aware of this. And this is why when I was using in the title Arab, I thought this was a little bit of a regression because but I couldn't emphasize everything at the same time. But it is definitely something open for discussion nowadays, especially that there is more, at least from some quarters, more attention paid to diversity, to pluralism, and to that area beyond the geographic confines, the diaspora, especially in a region, as you see, where people are pushed out of their homes in various ways, whether it's by settlers, whether it's by wars and economic disasters, and today environmental disasters. Definitely. So your point is very well taken. Not to say anything about the Arab and Muslim. Is it Arab? Is it Muslim? Is it the same? Is it not the same? That also is a whole Pandora box to be looked into. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for all your answers. We have time for maybe one more quick question if there's any final questions. Otherwise, we can bring this very interesting discussion to a close. But is there any last questions? Usama, yes, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for this very, very, very exciting talk. It was very intellectually stimulating and very well presented. So I wanted to ask, are there any lessons we can learn from, when shall we say, early golden age, or I mean when the Arabic civilization began to take over large parts of the Middle East, shall we say? I'm talking about right after the Prophet's era. Are there any lessons we can take from how the philosophy developed in sophistication then to how it can now perhaps evolve in this post-colonial era?
Thank you, Sama. I have no idea because I don't know that history very well. I remember I work on the modern and the contemporary, but maybe this is an occasion for me to repeat again that empire projects do not excite me much. There are some voices with which I sympathize a lot in the Arab world, people like Khatibi, for instance, the Moroccan, who celebrated so well being marginal and being weak and being poor, not for the sake of being poor, but as a chance to escape temptations of empire. I know your question was not about that, but I wouldn't know how to answer that. You mean the conditions of those times and their consequences for philosophy making, and how do they compare for the conditions today? I wouldn't know how to answer that. Sorry.
Well, I was referring to, I've just started reading about this. So for example, how the early Arabs had their own philosophical questions. They were developing their own intellectual framework in light of the new thinking about Islam. And then there began this assimilation movement of Greek thinkers and Indian thinkers in other parts of the world, but then they assimilated parts of it, and then they used that to develop questions within their own framework. And then that was very multicultural. So any inspiration, I mean, that's a sort of like a leading question, but I mean, any sort of suggestions on that front for what we could do, that any parallels you might see?
Some Arab thinkers have said, you know, Arabs at the time were able to open up to all these different sources and appropriate whatever served their own agendas, intellectual agendas, because they were comfortable with themselves or in a position of power and not subjugated and humiliated like they are today. Yeah, and perhaps this brings me to comment on what Danny Postel added here on chat. I was not meaning that if you use all those who refer Arendt and others in their work necessarily, you know, fall into these choices to make, either to be authentic and or be subjugated to other people's theories. Not at all. But I'm saying sometimes it brings up that kind of judgment. But indeed, you are absolutely right, Danny, that also in the Arab world, you were saying in Iran, but also in the Arab world, there are theories really who benefit, who seek inspiration or who nurture their theories by looking very broadly. And let me end by saying that it's a pity that there is little South-South inspiration that goes on. We don't read enough Africans and Latin Americans and Indians and Asians. It's a pity. It's a pity. I think we would benefit a lot from people who perhaps are closer to us in some of their concerns.
Thank you so much. I think we'll close it there. And thank you so much again, Professor Kassab, for joining us. And thank you to everyone for your questions. As I mentioned, I'm just going to quickly reshare the link. There is now a lovely YouTube channel for the Center for Global Comparative Philosophies here at SOAS. So I'm just going to reshare that link, and you can rewatch this talk in a hopefully a week or two's time once that's uploaded. So thanks again, and we'll see you all next time.
All right. Good luck to you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all. Thanks.